The evening had been planned for weeks. The large house on the hill was glowing with warm lights, and expensive cars lined the long driveway. Inside, soft music played while well-dressed guests moved from room to room, holding glasses and laughing easily. Everything looked perfect, polished, and controlled. This was the kind of place where people spoke softly, not because they were kind, but because power lived in quiet confidence. In the middle of it all stood a grand piano. It wasn't there to be played seriously. It was more like a symbol, something elegant to look at, something that showed taste and wealth. Most guests walked past it without much thought, only stopping to admire its shine. Away from the crowd. Close to the wall, the caretaker moved silently. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn. His job was to make sure nothing was out of place. He collected empty glasses, wiped small spills, and kept an eye on doors and corners. No one greeted him. No one asked his name. To most of the guests, he was just part of the building, like the walls or the floor. The caretaker was used to this. He had worked in places like this before: big houses, fancy events, people who didn't look twice at him. He didn't complain. He didn't expect attention. He believed his work mattered even if no one noticed. Still, something about this night felt different. Every time he passed the piano, his steps slowed just a little. His eyes lingered on the keys. The white and black patterns seemed to pull him in. He never touched it, not even by accident. He knew his place. But inside him, something stirred, something old and familiar. Across the room, the host of the evening held court. He was a well-known millionaire, confident and loud in a controlled way. People leaned in when he spoke. They laughed quickly at his jokes. He enjoyed that power. He enjoyed knowing that his words mattered more than others. Tonight he was in a playful mood. He cracked jokes about business, about success, about people who made it and people who didn't. The guests laughed, nodding along, eager to show they belonged in his world. A few of his jokes brushed close to arrogance, but no one challenged him. At one point, his eyes landed on the caretaker. The man was quietly adjusting a chair near the piano. "Well," the millionaire said, raising his voice slightly, "looks like even the furniture has helped tonight." A small wave of laughter passed through the group. The caretaker paused for a moment, then continued working as if he hadn't heard. He had learned long ago that reacting only made things worse. The millionaire smiled, encouraged by the response. "I always say everyone has a role," he continued. "Some people build the stage and others perform on it." More laughter. Some guests glanced at the caretaker, then quickly looked away. A few felt uncomfortable, but said nothing. The caretaker's hands tightened slightly around the cloth he was holding. His face stayed calm, but his mind drifted. He remembered another room years ago, smaller, colder, a piano that wasn't shiny but sounded alive. He pushed the memory aside and focused on his work. As the evening went on, the jokes grew bolder. The millionaire enjoyed pushing limits, testing how far he could go. He spoke about talent, success, and how not everyone is meant for greatness. His eyes flicked toward the caretaker again, almost without thinking. "And not everyone," he added with a grin, "should be allowed near expensive instruments." This time the laughter was louder. Someone even clapped. The caretaker felt a quiet sting, but he didn't show it. He walked toward the far side of the room, putting distance between himself and the piano. Still, his thoughts wouldn't leave it. The sound of keys echoed in his mind, notes he hadn't played in years. The room buzzed with conversation, but near the caretaker there was silence. He felt invisible again, and strangely, that felt safer. He stopped near a window, pretending to check the curtains. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance. He took a slow breath. Nights like this reminded him of how life had turned out: steady work, long hours, quiet respect only from himself. But then something changed. The millionaire's attention returned to the piano. Someone had asked if a professional musician would be playing later. The host laughed. "No need," he said. "That thing is just decoration tonight." Then, almost without thinking, he added, "Unless our caretaker here wants to give us a performance." The room reacted instantly. Heads turned. Smiles widened. It sounded like a joke, but it landed heavier than that. The caretaker felt every eye on him. His heart beat faster. He hadn't expected to be pulled into the spotlight. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Words felt stuck. "Oh, come on," the millionaire said, waving a hand. "You work around it all night. Surely you've pressed a key or two." A few guests laughed again, but this time, the laughter was thinner. The caretaker took a small step forward, then stopped. He knew he could refuse. He should refuse. That would be the smart choice. But something inside him pushed back. Not pride, not anger. "Just truth. I used to play," he said quietly. The room went still for half a second. Then a ripple of surprise moved through the guests. "Used to?" The millionaire repeated. "Well, that was probably a long time ago." The caretaker nodded. "Yes, a long time. And you think you still remember?" The host asked, smiling as if enjoying a game. "I remember enough." The caretaker replied. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. That steadiness caught a few people off guard. The millionaire raised his eyebrows. For the first time that night, he studied the caretaker more closely. The man didn't look nervous. He didn't look angry. He just looked honest. "Well," the host said after a pause, "this should be entertaining." He gestured toward the piano. The caretaker hesitated. He looked at the keys again. Up close, they looked smaller than he remembered, almost fragile. He thought about the years he had spent away from music, the nights he had worked late, the moments he had swallowed dreams to survive. He placed the cloth down carefully. The room grew quiet. Not because anyone asked for silence, but because curiosity had taken over. Some guests leaned forward. Others folded their arms, expecting embarrassment. The caretaker walked toward the piano, each step slow and deliberate. He wasn't trying to make a point. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. He was simply responding to a call he had ignored for too long. He reached the bench and paused, for a brief moment. The caretaker closed his eyes, and that was when the night truly began to change. The caretaker sat down slowly on the piano bench. It felt unfamiliar under him, firmer than the old benches he remembered. The room stayed quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind filled with expectation, doubt, and curiosity. Some people leaned closer, others crossed their arms, ready to laugh if things went wrong. The millionaire stood a few steps away, holding his glass, watching closely. His smile was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer playful. It was sharp, like he was waiting for something amusing to happen. The caretaker rested his hands in his lap for a moment. His fingers trembled slightly. Not because he was scared of the people, but because of the piano itself. It had been years. Too many years. Life had pulled him away little by little, until music became something he carried only in memory. Someone in the crowd cleared their throat. Another person checked their phone. A soft cough echoed across the room. "Any time," the millionaire said lightly. The caretaker nodded. He lifted his hands and placed them gently on the keys. They felt cool, smooth, familiar in a way that surprised him. His shoulders relaxed just a bit. He didn't start playing right away. That pause felt long to the people watching. A few smiles turned into smirks. One guest whispered something to another. It sounded like a joke, but the caretaker didn't hear it. His mind was somewhere else now. He took a slow breath and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost shy. Not loud enough to impress anyone. A few people exchanged looks. The millionaire tilted his head, unimpressed. Then the caretaker pressed another key. And another. The notes were simple, slow, careful, like someone testing the ground before taking a step forward. Some guests relaxed, thinking this would be short and harmless. Others lost interest already, but then the music began to change. The caretaker's fingers started moving with more confidence. The pauses shortened. The notes connected. A gentle pattern formed, one that felt thoughtful and controlled. Conversations stopped, not all at once, but one by one. Someone lowered their glass. Another turned fully toward the piano. The caretaker wasn't looking at the crowd. His eyes were focused on the keys, but not in a stiff way. His hands remembered more than he expected. Each note unlocked another memory, another feeling he thought he had lost. The music grew deeper. It wasn't fast or flashy. It was emotional, honest. The kind of sound that made people feel before they understood why. The millionaire's smile faded. He didn't notice it at first. He took a sip from his glass, then stopped halfway. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. A woman near the back straightened her posture. A man who had been whispering earlier fell silent. The room was changing, slowly but clearly. The caretaker's back stayed straight, but his shoulders loosened as the music flowed. He wasn't trying to perform. He wasn't thinking about impressing anyone. He was simply playing the way he used to when no one was watching. When music was just a conversation between him and the piano, the notes filled the room, bouncing off the walls, slipping into corners where laughter had been just moments ago. The sound carried warmth, sadness, hope, and something else, something that felt lived in. The millionaire shifted his weight. He looked around, noticing the silence. This wasn't the polite silence of respect for him. This silence belonged to the caretaker now. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. The caretaker moved into a new section of the piece. His left hand held steady while his right hand danced lightly across the keys. It was clear now, this wasn't luck. This wasn't someone randomly pressing keys. This was skill. A guest near the front whispered, "He's good." Another replied quietly, "Very good." The millionaire heard them. His jaw tightened. The caretaker's expression remained calm, but inside, emotions rose. Memories of long nights practicing, of cold rooms and tired hands, of moments when music was the only thing that made sense. He felt those moments again, not as pain, but as proof that they had mattered. His fingers moved faster now, but never rushed. Every note had space. Every pause had meaning. Someone in the crowd felt a lump in their throat. They didn't know why. They hadn't expected to feel anything at all. The caretaker reached a softer part of the music. The volume dropped, pulling everyone closer without a word. Even the people at the edges leaned in slightly, afraid to miss something. The millionaire stood completely still. His glass rested forgotten at his side. His joke had turned into something else. Something he could not control. For the first time that night, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. The caretaker's hands slowed. The music grew quiet again, almost like the beginning. But different, wiser, fuller, as if the song had traveled somewhere and come back changed. He played the final notes gently and let them fade. No one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because the moment felt fragile. Like clapping too soon would break something. The caretaker let his hands rest on the keys for a second longer, then lifted them slowly. He opened his eyes and looked around. The room felt different now. Faces that once held amusement now held surprise, respect, even regret. The caretaker stood up carefully. He adjusted the bench the way he had found it. He picked up his cloth from the floor. Still, no one spoke. Finally, someone near the back started clapping. Softly at first. Then another joined. And another. Soon the room filled with applause. Not loud and wild, but steady and sincere. The caretaker nodded once, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being seen like this. He turned slightly, ready to return to his work. Before he could take a step, the millionaire spoke. That was... He paused, searching for the right word. Unexpected. The caretaker looked at him, not defensively, not proudly. Just calmly. I didn't mean to interrupt, the caretaker said. You asked. The millionaire swallowed. A few guests watched him closely now. The balance of the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. No, the millionaire said slowly. You didn't interrupt? He glanced at the piano, then back at the caretaker. I didn't know. The caretaker gave a small shrug. Most people don't. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. The millionaire forced a small laugh, but it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Well, he said, I suppose I underestimated you. The caretaker nodded politely. It happens. A few guests smiled at that. The caretaker turned to leave, but something held him back. Not pride. Not anger. Just a sense that this moment mattered. Even if he didn't fully understand why, he walked back toward the wall, blending into the background again. But the room no longer saw him the same way. As the evening continued, Conversations slowly returned, but they were different now, quieter, more careful. Every now and then someone glanced toward the caretaker with curiosity. The piano stood silently again. But it no longer felt like decoration, and the millionaire, though still surrounded by people, felt a strange weight settle in his chest. A joke had gone further than he planned, and for the first time in a long while he wasn't sure how to laugh it off. The room stayed quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer full of awkward tension or anticipation. Now it carried something heavier, something that felt alive. The caretaker had returned to the wall, but everyone's attention stayed on him. On the piano, on the invisible thread connecting the two. Guests whispered softly among themselves, unsure if they should speak, afraid to disturb what had just happened. Some leaned closer, trying to catch every subtle detail, every thought that the music might have left behind. The caretaker's hands itched to play again, but he didn't rush. He remembered every moment of that first song, the touch of the keys, the sound, the emotion that had slipped through them. He realized then how much he had missed this part of himself. Music had been quiet in his life for years, buried under work, responsibility, and the endless demands of survival. But tonight it called him back like an old friend. He moved slowly to the piano again, every step measured, deliberate. This time, he didn't just approach the keys, he studied them. Each key seemed to wait for him, holding its breath. His fingers hovered above the surface, and for a long moment he did nothing. The guests leaned forward, the millionaire included, holding their breath without realizing it. The room felt smaller somehow, as if all the space had been filled by invisible anticipation. Then softly he touched the first note. It was almost a whisper, delicate and careful. He didn't strike it with force. He let it sing naturally, allowing it to resonate through the hall. The sound was different this time, richer, deeper, filled with more than just melody. It carried memory, longing, and years of hidden talent. People instinctively quieted, letting the sound reach them. Conversations faded completely. As if the room itself had leaned in to listen, the caretaker's hands began to move with more confidence. He remembered old techniques, long-forgotten rhythms and patterns that had once been second nature. Each note built on the previous one, forming a story that no one had expected to hear. It wasn't just music, it was emotion translated into sound, a bridge between who he had been and who he was now. The millionaire's laughter from before was gone. His face, once smug and playful, now carried curiosity mixed with disbelief. He had thought this would be a brief, almost laughable display, a joke for his guests to enjoy. Instead, he was witnessing something powerful, a reminder that talent cannot always be measured by appearances. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. They had been prepared to laugh, to see embarrassment. Now they were silent, captivated, unsure how to respond. The music wasn't loud or showy. It wasn't meant to impress by complexity or speed. It impressed by truth, by honesty, by a connection to something real, something human that no wealth or status could replicate. The caretaker played with intention now, allowing the music to flow naturally. His left hand held steady, grounding the rhythm, while his right hand danced lightly across the keys, creating melodies that felt both familiar and new. Each phrase seemed to tell a story of quiet nights, of struggles overcome, of hope that survived despite hardship. There was a subtle sadness, yes, but it was tempered with strength and beauty. Someone in the back felt tears prick their eyes. They didn't understand exactly why. They hadn't known him, hadn't known his story, yet the music spoke directly to their emotions. It was human in a way that words rarely were, something primal and undeniable. The air in the room felt charged, almost sacred. As if the piano and its player had opened a window into a different world, the millionaire's expression shifted again. He looked at the caretaker, then at the piano, then back at the caretaker. Confusion, admiration, and something else, regret, flitted across his face. He realized that his joke had underestimated more than just talent. It had underestimated resilience, experience, and the quiet strength of someone who had spent years unseen and undervalued. The caretaker's movements grew smoother, more fluid. The notes began to interweave, creating layers that demanded attention. People leaned closer, drawn by the sound, unable to look away. The piano wasn't just an instrument tonight, it was a storyteller, and he was the voice. Every press of a key, every pause, every subtle shift in rhythm was a sentence, a paragraph, a chapter in a story that could only be told this way. Time seemed to slow. Minutes passed, though no one checked their watches. The world outside the room disappeared. The chandeliers, the soft lights, the conversations, they all faded into background noise. What mattered was this, the caretaker and the piano, and the bridge they had built between past and present. Guests began to notice details they hadn't before. The way his fingers moved with ease even after years of neglect. The subtle shifts in tone that carried meaning. The way his expression softened at certain passages, as if remembering moments he had thought were lost forever. This was not practice. This was living memory. This was art. The millionaire finally spoke, though his voice was quieter than before. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. There was no humor, no smugness, only honesty. The caretaker didn't respond. He didn't need to. The music was answer enough. The melody reached a quieter, more reflective section. The caretaker let the notes linger, allowing the silence between them to carry weight. The audience felt it too. It was a pause full of meaning, a chance to breathe, a chance to reflect on what they were witnessing. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others watched intently, studying the small movements of his hands, trying to understand how such beauty could come from someone so overlooked. Then, slowly, the music began to rise again. The caretaker's hands gained momentum, building toward something powerful but controlled. The dynamic shifted, creating tension and release, showing the full range of emotion he had carried inside him for years. Guests felt themselves drawn in, caught between admiration and awe. They were witnessing a transformation, something that could not be faked or rehearsed. The room was fully absorbed now. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Even the millionaire, usually the center of attention, faded into the background. The caretaker commanded the room through sound alone. His presence wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Each note told the story of a life quietly lived, of talent unnoticed, of potential finally realized. Finally, he reached the closing notes. They were soft, deliberate, and full of grace. He allowed them to fade naturally, leaving the room in a state of quiet reflection. No one immediately applauded. The moment was too fragile, too real to interrupt. The silence itself was the acknowledgement of something profound. When he lifted his hands from the keys, it was almost anticlimactic. But in that simple act, the room understood what had happened. Respect replaced laughter. Curiosity became admiration. The caretaker, who had spent years blending into the background, had reminded everyone present that true skill, true passion, and true humanity could not be judged by appearances. A slow clap began from the back of the room, hesitant but genuine. One by one, others joined, until the room was filled with steady applause. The caretaker nodded quietly, a small, humble gesture. He hadn't played for recognition or reward. He had played because it was who he was. The millionaire raised his hand slightly, signaling the applause should continue. His face was unreadable, a mixture of humility and surprise. He had expected a joke, a moment of laughter. Instead, he had witnessed the power of authenticity and talent. The lesson was clear: no one should ever underestimate someone based on what they see on the surface. The caretaker stepped away from the piano. He adjusted his clothes and picked up his cleaning cloth, returning to his duties as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. The guests, the millionaire, and even the piano itself would never be the same. A quiet man had stepped forward, touched hearts with music, and reminded everyone that respect is earned, often in silence, and sometimes from the most unexpected places. Even as the conversation slowly restarted and glasses were raised again, a new energy lingered. People whispered about the caretaker, about the piano, about the honesty and what they had just experienced. And somewhere in the room, the millionaire stared at the instrument, realizing that tonight a joke had turned into something far more serious and unforgettable. The room was still buzzing quietly after the caretaker's performance. People were talking again, but it wasn't the same as before. Their voices were softer, more thoughtful. Some guests whispered to one another, trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. The music had left an impression that no one could easily shake off. It was not just talent, they felt something more, something human, something real. The millionaire leaned against the wall, watching the caretaker. His usual confidence was gone. He had expected a moment of amusement, a small joke that would entertain his guests. Instead, he had seen something that he couldn't control, couldn't predict. He realized, slowly and unwillingly, that he had misjudged the man he had mocked. The caretaker had not only played beautifully, but he had also carried a lifetime of emotion into every note. A guest, curious and bold, approached the caretaker quietly. You played that beautifully. Where did you learn?" they asked. The caretaker looked at the guest, a small smile appearing almost shyly. "A long time ago," he said. "When I was younger, I had lessons. I practiced every day. Life just happened, and I had to stop." The words were simple, but they held weight. People began to realize that the caretaker's story was more than just music. It was about struggle, sacrifice, and hidden talent. The room shifted again, not physically, but emotionally. Respect replaced judgment. Admiration replaced amusement. The millionaire, still watching, felt a pang of guilt. He had laughed, mocked, and assumed. He had made the caretaker feel small in front of everyone, and now he realized the joke had backfired in the most unexpected way. The man he thought was invisible had stepped forward and shown him the truth. Sometimes the most quiet, overlooked people carried the most depth. Someone else in the crowd spoke up. "You must have been a professional once. Right? That style, the control. It's incredible." The caretaker shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I was never professional. Life didn't allow me to. But I loved it. I still do." Another guest asked, "Did you ever think you'd play for people like this again?" The caretaker's eyes drifted to the piano. "I didn't think it would matter," he said. "I played because it was mine. Because I had to." The millionaire cleared his throat. His voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. I owe you an apology," he said. "I made a joke, and it was wrong. I underestimated you, and I shouldn't have. You've shown everyone here something important tonight." The caretaker nodded politely. He didn't smile broadly, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in his expression. The guests began to understand more about the caretaker. They saw him not just as someone who cleaned the house, not just as someone who served in the background, but as a person with depth, talent, and a story that mattered. They began asking questions, not about the joke, not about wealth, but about him. Where he had learned, what he had felt while playing, how music had been a part of his life all these years. The caretaker spoke slowly, humbly. He explained that his life had not been easy. Opportunities had been limited. Responsibilities had been heavy. But he had never let go of music entirely. Even if he couldn't play for an audience, he had played in private, at night, when the house was quiet. It had been his escape, his comfort, his way of keeping himself whole. A few guests nodded knowingly. Some had hidden talents or passions of their own, and they recognized the dedication it took to keep them alive despite the pressures of daily life. The room began to feel warmer, more connected. People weren't looking at the caretaker as a servant anymore. They were seeing him as a human being, someone with dreams, discipline, and heart. The millionaire, still watching, felt something shift inside him. He had spent the evening as a host, as a figure of power. Tonight, he realized that power was not about wealth, about status, about who could command attention. Power was about influence, yes, but also about humility and recognition of others. The caretaker had taught him that lesson without intending to. One of the guests leaned closer to the millionaire and whispered, "He's incredible. You really underestimated him." The millionaire nodded, still quietly absorbing the truth. He glanced at the caretaker again. "Yes," he said softly, "I did." The caretaker, meanwhile, was returning to his usual tasks, adjusting chairs, wiping surfaces, and moving quietly around the room. But now, the atmosphere around him had changed. People noticed him. They offered small smiles, polite nods, even quiet words of encouragement. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen, not because of his job, but because of who he was, what he had shared, and the courage it took to step forward when called. The piano, too, seemed different. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It had become a symbol of hidden potential, of beauty that could emerge from unexpected places, of the power of dedication and passion. People would remember tonight not just for the music, but for the lesson it carried, that talent and worth are not always obvious, that the quietest voices often have the most to say. The millionaire took a deep breath. He stepped closer to the caretaker, this time without jokes or sarcasm. "I want you to know," he said, "that I respect you. What you've done here tonight. It matters. And I hope you know that." The caretaker nodded again, modestly. He didn't need to say anything. The acknowledgement was enough. Guests began to leave the room in small groups, but the conversation continued. They discussed the music, the emotion, the skill, and the human story behind it. Some even promised themselves they would look closer at the people around them in their own lives, to notice, to appreciate, to respect what might be hidden. Behind quiet faces and unassuming roles, the caretaker returned to the piano for a brief moment, as if checking it, touching it lightly. His fingers brushed the keys gently. It wasn't a performance. It was a small, private gesture, a way of reconnecting with something personal, something sacred. And in that simple act, the room felt the weight of his story again, subtle but undeniable. The millionaire watched silently. He realized that tonight the lesson wasn't just about music or talent. It was about respect, about humility, about recognizing the humanity in others before making assumptions. It was about understanding that every person has a story, and sometimes the quietest people hold the deepest truths. By the end of the evening, the caretaker had returned to his normal duties, but no one forgot him. The guests left with a new perspective, the millionaire left with a lesson in humility, and the piano stood in the room, still and polished, holding the echoes of something extraordinary. And the caretaker, who had been invisible for so long, had finally been seen not for what he did for others, but for who he was, for the talent he had carried quietly for years, for the courage it took to touch the keys again in front of people who had expected nothing. Tonight, his life, his music, and his story had reached everyone in the room, leaving an impression that would not fade. The quiet man had spoken without words, had commanded attention without force, and had reminded everyone that respect, talent, and human worth are earned through action, integrity and heart, not through wealth, status, or appearance. And with that, the room was never quite the same again. The night was winding down, and the party had begun to quiet. Guests were drifting toward the doors, soft conversations filling the spaces between them. The chandeliers cast a gentle glow over the room, making the walls shimmer, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. It was no longer about wealth, status, or appearances. Tonight, the room held a quiet reverence for something real, something the caretaker had brought with him and shared without pride or showmanship. The caretaker moved among the guests, returning glasses to tables, adjusting chairs, and straightening small things that no one noticed. But this time, people noticed him. A few guests offered him polite smiles. Others nodded in acknowledgement. There were no jokes, no mocking comments, just a quiet respect that hadn't been there before. The man who had always been invisible in this room now carried a presence that no one could ignore. The millionaire, still near the piano, watched him carefully. His mind replayed the evening, the music, the quiet power of the performance. He realized how wrong he had been. His jokes, his assumptions, even his laughter had been small and foolish. Here was a man who had carried years of talent and emotion quietly, without needing recognition. And yet his performance had moved every person in the room. Slowly, the millionaire approached the caretaker. His voice was softer now, without the usual arrogance or showmanship. "I want to apologize again," he said. "What I said before, it was a joke, but it was wrong. I misjudged you." Tonight you've shown me something I can't ignore." The caretaker paused for a moment. He didn't smile widely, nor did he respond with words meant to flatter. He simply nodded. His quiet humility carried as much weight as any apology could. "Thank you," he said. That means a lot." A few guests had gathered nearby, curious and attentive. One of them asked, "Do you still play often?" The caretaker looked toward the piano, the keys reflecting the light softly. "Not like this," he said. "I play when I can, quietly for myself. But tonight, I wanted to share a little." The millionaire listened closely. He understood now that talent, passion, and perseverance often went unseen, unnoticed, and undervalued. He felt a strange mix of admiration and regret, realizing how easily he had overlooked the depth of a human being based solely on appearances. The caretaker moved back to his usual tasks, but his posture had changed. There was a quiet confidence in his steps, a calm strength that came from having been seen and recognized not for what he served, but for who he was. The room followed his every move subtly. Aware that this ordinary man had given them an extraordinary lesson, guests began to approach him one by one, offering thanks, compliments, and questions about his music. He responded humbly, never boasting, never exaggerating. He spoke simply about his past, about how music had been a constant companion even through hardship. He shared briefly that he had once trained seriously but had to give up for practical reasons. Life, he said, demanded sacrifices. And yet, despite all that, music had never left him. The millionaire listened silently, watching the respect growing around the caretaker. He realized that this was more than a performance. It was a story of resilience, of quiet perseverance, of the strength to keep one's passion alive despite life's obstacles. He felt humbled in a way he rarely did. At one point, the millionaire addressed the guests. "Tonight," he said, "we were reminded that talent and courage are not always obvious. We should never judge by what we see on the surface. This man has shown us that greatness can live quietly, unnoticed, and it can still touch everyone around it." The guests nodded in agreement. Some exchanged glances, realizing that they had learned more from this quiet caretaker than from any conversation or display of wealth during the evening. The lesson was clear: respect and admiration are earned by action, dedication, and heart, not by status, jokes, or appearances. The caretaker returned briefly to the piano. His fingers brushed the keys softly, not to perform, but to acknowledge the instrument that had carried him through so much of his life. The sound was gentle, a simple reflection of gratitude, of connection, of respect for what music had given him. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Sensing the quiet significance of the moment, the millionaire watched this in silence. He felt a strange mix of emotions: humility, admiration, and a realization that he had been part of a small but important transformation. He had learned that power and wealth could never replace the impact of authenticity, humility, and real talent. He had laughed at someone he thought insignificant, and yet that person had reminded him of what truly matters. The guests began to leave slowly, but the caretaker's presence lingered in their minds. People whispered about him as they exited, about the music, about the quiet strength it represented. He had shown them something important: that life often hides its most extraordinary stories in plain sight, waiting for a moment to be revealed. Finally, the millionaire approached the caretaker one last time. "If you ever want to play again in front of people for real this time," he said, "I would make sure everyone here would listen." The caretaker looked at him, a small smile forming not from pride, but from understanding. "I'll think about it," he said simply. The caretaker returned to his cleaning duties, walking through the room with calm certainty. He was still the same man in appearance, still quiet and unassuming, but something inside him had shifted. He had been seen, respected, and appreciated in a way he hadn't experienced in years. And that quiet acknowledgement mattered more than applause, more than jokes, more than recognition from wealth or status. As the evening ended, the house returned to its quiet state. The piano stood in the center of the room, polished and still, but now it held the echoes of something extraordinary. The caretaker had reminded everyone present that human worth is not measured by appearance or position, That talent can live quietly for years, and that respect is earned through integrity, dedication, and heart. Even after the last guest had left, the caretaker remained calm and composed. He knew the evening had changed him, just as it had changed those who had witnessed it. There was no boasting, no grand statements, just a quiet satisfaction, a recognition that he had shared a part of himself. And that part had made a difference. In that simple, human way, the caretaker had transformed the room, the guests, and even the millionaire. A joke had turned serious, assumptions had been shattered, and a life lived quietly had finally been acknowledged. And as he moved through the mansion one last time, adjusting chairs and straightening tables, he felt a sense of completion. A sense that the night had been more than an event, it had been a lesson in humanity, respect, and the quiet power of talent. The caretaker left the piano untouched after that. But he didn't need to play again to leave a mark. His music, his story, and his presence had spoken for themselves. And in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, the message remained clear: never underestimate someone, never judge by appearance, and always recognize the hidden strength and talent in the people around you. By the time the lights dimmed completely and the mansion returned to its stillness, the caretaker had finished his duties. Yet, even in silence, the impact of his evening lingered. He had shown that greatness often comes quietly, without fanfare, and that the simplest actions, when carried with authenticity and heart, can touch everyone and change how they see the world. The caretaker stepped outside briefly, breathing in the cool night air. The city lights sparkled in the distance, but they seemed less important now. Tonight he had learned something as well, that sometimes the smallest steps touching a key, sharing a moment of talent, can create ripples far larger than anyone expects. And for once he felt seen, valued, and respected, not for what he served, but for who he truly was. The night had ended, but its lesson would linger long after. In humility, in talent, and in quiet courage there is power that cannot be ignored. And the caretaker, who had been invisible for so long, had finally stepped forward to remind everyone of that truth.